Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here tonight, and appreciate those songs that we sung because, the last one especially goes especially just perfectly well with the lesson and what we'll be talking about. Particularly with this lesson, where the thought began, which I was kind of chuckling when Chuck was talking about like his fourth point today. He was like, "This is what the sermon was like crafted around." It always seems to be that way. I don't know. It's like there's one thought, and then like everything else kind of like grows and develops around it. And the thought that I had was this image of a crown. Like, what does a crown signify, and what does it mean? And so to begin with that question of what are crowns for us today? Like, how are we familiar with them? In particular, like that idea of like a kingship of a crown. And so we don't really have like a kingdom with like kings and queens today. We only have like more symbolic ones, like in Great Britain, with like monarchies and stuff like that. We don't really have many real like kings or rulers. And did I say king? Yeah, king. Unfortunately, the queen has passed. Sorry, but we only have like these symbols of them. They're a very like ancient concept. So then I was thinking about well, how do I hear that term used? Like when someone's like crowned as the king or whatever. It's often it's in sports. Like we think about someone being the king. Think about someone being like the best of the best. Like that guy's the king. And like King James or whatever, or whoever might be the best in a certain like sport or field. And this kind of starts to get us more in the realm of what biblically it means for someone to be crowned. So now let's dive into that, because that's where I want to now zoom in and focus our next little bit is, what does it mean for someone to be crowned in the Bible? So a helpful Bible study tactic, if you're looking at maybe like a theme or an idea, is to look at the first time that idea or that theme is mentioned. And so what is the first time, well, I guess it's not a Bible class, but if I was to ask you, I was like, well, what's the first time we see someone crowned in the Bible? And so this is a great trivia question for whenever you're just at a party and someone asks you this, so you can answer them. And the first time we see someone actually given a crown in the Bible is, you might think maybe King David, or maybe some king that's mentioned randomly in Genesis or something. The first time we see it happen is in Exodus chapter 39. Exodus 39. If you will, turn over and look at this real quick. And then leave a marker here, because we'll be coming back to Exodus in just a second. But in Exodus 39, this was surprising to me. I wasn't really expecting this, because what's happened in these latter chapters of Exodus is Moses has received the instructions for the tabernacle, this tent that God will dwell in so that he can be with his people. And then these last chapters is basically a repeat of all of those details of what the tabernacle and how it is to be built, except now they are building it. And so they have this long detail of them building the tabernacle, and then it concludes right here in chapter 39 with the making of the garments that the priests were supposed to wear. So this is just this long section about talking about how they're supposed to be gold and blue and purple, scarlet material, finely twisted linen that they make these garments with for the priest. And then look down in verse 30. And it concludes with this turban, this part of the garments that the high priest wears. And he wears, it says, they make a plate for the holy crown. And they of pure gold, and you wrote upon it with an engraved writing, found it on a signet. It says, "Holy to Yahweh." And they fastened a blue cord to it, and they fastened the turban above, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. So notice again, let me just reread that. It says, this is Exodus chapter 39 and verse 30. It says, they make a plate of the holy crown of pure gold, and wrote upon it with an engraved writing, found as a signet, "Holy to Yahweh." So the high priest is the first one that is crowned in the Bible. He has this golden crown that's put on his head. And what it says on that crown is "Holy to Yahweh," holy to the Lord. It's setting him apart as someone to represent the people to God. That's what the high priest and the rest of the priesthood is supposed to do. They're supposed to mediate between God and the people. To relate that today, here's just a little example that someone shared with me one time, and it's always stuck with me, so I want to share it with y'all. is when if I was to go out to my car right now and I pop the hood of the car and I look underneath the hood, there's a very complicated piece of machinery called a car engine. And I don't know how that works. I can tell you where the dipstick is to like check the oil. Like here's the battery. Like I know that's the battery, how to change it. Don't ask me to do that, but that's the battery. And then there's the bit for the windshield wiper fluid over here. But like that's the extent of my knowledge of my car engine. Now I can take that car engine I can take it to a special place where there's a special group of people that wear their special garments and they're the overalls and they have little name tags, tell me their name. And those guys, they know how this thing works. They know how this complicated engine works. They can tell me what's wrong with it. And I trust them that they've been trained since they were a youth and they've worked on cars, and these mechanics, they know how to work on this engine, and they can mediate for me between this very different thing than I am, this engine, and they know how to work on it, and then they can tell me how to fix it and stuff like that. Priesthood works very similar to that, and the analogy falls apart in some ways, but that's a helpful image for you maybe as you're reading about the priesthood, is they had to learn all these different like rituals and practices for sacrifices, and they would mediate between God and the people so that they could represent them before him. But what I want to hone in on is how that the crown that the high priest wears says, holy to Yahweh, holy to him. And so it's like this crown is this thing that sets him apart so that he can do this special work for the Lord. Okay? Tracking with that? Great. No questions asked. So we're just going to keep moving on. So next is the more obvious one that maybe you would have thought of, is the people that are usually crowned in the Bible are kings. Kings of the monarchy in the nation of Israel. It's associated with the throne. And you don't have to turn here. If you do, if you're one of those people, go ahead and look over at 1 Kings chapter 11, which this is a very cool story. It's right in the middle of, actually, that's supposed to say 2 Kings. Very sorry about that. Go to 2 Kings chapter 11 if you're going to follow along there. But this is a story, I mean, it's a really intense story. There's been there was an evil queen who takes over and she slaughters all of the sons of the king, and she sets herself up as the queen of the nation of Judah. And then what a group does, like a group of rebels, like this underground group forms, and they take and they hide one of the sons of the king, and they hide him in the temple. And they hide him in the temple, and then years later, once he's grown up enough, they take him, and it's like a whole conspiracy. Like they make a conspiracy where there's going to be like guys who stand guard as they crown the king in the temple. Okay, sorry. It's interesting how when you say things out loud, things jump out to you. So the crowning of the high priest happened at the tabernacle. And then now in this story, there's the crowning of the king also happening in the temple, which was the development of the tabernacle. We're going to have to set that aside. I'm going to let that one cook for later. That sounds like an article or something. I don't know. Anyway, sorry to side rail there. But back to the story at hand. The king here is being set apart, and he's being crowned, and then the people just start shouting, like, long live the king. And then the queen hears it, and she's like, conspiracy, conspiracy. And then they take her out, and they kill her, and then set the other guy up as king. It's a really intense story. But again, this line of kings is associated with a special role, a special office they were supposed to play in the nation of Israel. Like the high priest mediated for God between the people and Israel, the king rules on behalf of God. He's supposed to be like the reign of God to the people as well. And so if all of that, if you were kind of locked in right at the beginning, and then I just start rambling about stuff, or I go on a random side trail and I lose your attention, I bring you back now. We're going to come to this checkpoint right here, the overlap of what it means for someone to be crowned in the Bible. Here's the main point, okay? The overlap of these two crowned roles is the glory of God. That's what it means for someone to be crowned in the Bible. It's them being set apart specifically for the glory of God. So if you will, I told you to leave your marker in Exodus. So now go back to Exodus chapter 28. Exodus 28. This is the bit where they were getting the instructions about the priest's garments, about when they first were supposed to make them. And it tells us why they were supposed to make these garments. It says they were made for two reasons. Exodus chapter 28 and verse 2, it says, "You shall make the holy garments for Aaron your brother for glory and for beauty." And so these garments have function. First off, they're just beautiful garments to like signify his role. But then also they're for glory, okay? Glory. Glory for who? For the high priest? For who? Is the question there. But I believe in, and I'll hopefully show you in a second here, that it's glory for God. And then the second point that I want to make is maybe how does the kingship role relate to the glory of God? Well, this comes a little bit later. And if you want to just listen, I'll read from Isaiah 11 here. Because Isaiah picks up this idea of one that's supposed to come from the line of David. David was supposed to have a king that God promised would sit and reign forever and ever. And so Isaiah writes in Isaiah 11, he starts and he talks about how there's going to be this one to come from the stem of Jesse. So he's making this analogy, like the line of David is like this branch that will start to grow up from the stem of Jesse. Jesse was David's father. And so we're looking for this one to come from the kingship of David. And it says that he'll rule, and he'll rule with the rod of his mouth. So it's like his words are the thing that is his power. And with the breath of his lips, he'll put the wicked to death. And then what the result of that is that all of creation is in harmony, and there's peace, and there's fellowship between God and man. And then in verse 10 of Isaiah 11, it says that in that day, the nations will seek the root of Jesse. So there's one to come from Jesse, from the line of David. The people are going to seek after him. It says he will be set as a standard for the peoples. So a standard is like a flag, a rallying point. This one to come will be like a rallying point for the peoples, and says his resting place will be glorious. His resting place will be glory. So with the priesthood, they're set apart, and their role is for the glory of God. And then also, this one to come from the kingship line of David is going to be his resting place, where he's raised as a standard for everyone to rally to him, will be glorious. And so I keep using that word, glory, right? So we talked about how someone being crowned is setting them apart for the glory of God. But what does it mean what is the glory of God? Like when I keep saying that word glory, what does that mean in the Bible? If you will, if you're still over there in Exodus, hopefully, go back just a few more chapters, or forward a few chapters, to Exodus chapter 33. Exodus 33. So right here, I believe I mentioned this before, but repetition is important. What we're about to read is one of the most referenced and quoted verses throughout the whole Bible. This is a moment where Moses, let's just read it. Go to Exodus chapter 33, look at verse 18. Moses is on the mountain of Sinai, and he says to God, then Moses said, "I pray to you, show me your glory." And then God responds, and he says, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of Yahweh before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show compassion to whom I will show compassion." But he says, "You cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live." And then he tells them about how there's this cleft in the rock he's going to hide him in. And what he's going to do is he's going to cover that cleft with his hand. And then when he passes by, Moses will only see the back of him. So it's only going to be like a fraction of God's glory. And what happens whenever Moses sees that, just the back of God, when he sees just the back of God's glory, what happens? Look in chapter 34 now. Turn over to chapter 34. It says, verse 5, start in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 5. "Then Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood before there with him, and he called upon the name of Yahweh. Then Yahweh passed by in front of him, and he called out, 'Yahweh, Yahweh, a God compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on their grandchildren to the third and the fourth generation.' And Moses made haste to bow low towards the earth and to worship." So Moses makes this very bold request of God, but it's after they've had this long developing relationship through the story of Exodus so far. He asks for him to show him his glory. And then when God passes by and allows him just to see the back of his glory, what does Moses hear? What does Moses see? He doesn't see like maybe some impressive like thunder or like some storm or fire of some sort. What he gets is a description. When he's asked to see God's glory, God tells him something. He reveals who he is in his nature, in his character. He gives him a list of attributes. So when the Bible uses this word glory, because, okay, if I'm being completely honest with y'all, this word glory, it always seems to like be something I study, I look at, and I kind of get, and then it kind of like slips away. Like it's like I can't like root myself in, because it's such a big word. It's just one of those like big Bible words. But the thing that I always come back to is this, which I think this really is where you can drive your stake down on glory, is that glory is who God is. Glory is his character, and it's his attributes. That's what it means when it says the glory of God. It's like it's who he is, personally, connectedly. What does he look like when he exemplifies what he does and who he is out into creation? That's what the core of glory is who God is. Okay? So now moving on from here, I want us to think back to that Isaiah passage. Because throughout the whole story of the Bible, it's kind of like we're looking for someone who can be to be God's glory, to be that image of God we were called to be in the very beginning. What Adam and Eve were first called to be was to bear God's image, which is to be who he is. But they failed on that account. And then we kind of meet a guy named Noah, and he's pretty good, but then he fails as well. And then we meet a guy named Abraham, and he's looking really good, but then he fails again. And then it's just like all of these people show up, and then they all have this moment where they fail. Or as Paul puts it, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have failed to meet this standard of who he is. But like that passage in Isaiah says, there's going to be one to come, and he will reveal God's, and his resting place will be glorious. He will be the one who reveals God's glory. And so, of course, what all this is leading to is how will this glory be revealed? Who's going to be the one to come who will be that glory of God, who will show that glory to us? And then, of course, who walks on the scene? But you open up your Bible to the New Testament, and Jesus, the revealer of the glory of God. If you will, turn over to John 1, because glory is a major, major theme in the book of John. And if you have time, which I don't think it will take you any more than maybe an hour to read through the Gospel of John sometime, track that word glory, because we were talking about in the Bible class a couple weeks ago, key words. Glory is one that runs from beginning to end in John. And look at how he starts out. We're just going to kind of follow it through. We're just going to follow through this idea of tracking with the glory in the Gospel of John. So it starts out in chapter 1, verse 18. It concludes at the very end of this intro that John's given to his gospel, verses 1 through 18, and it ends with him saying this. Like, remember how God said, "No one can see me and live"? Well, John concludes his intro this way. He says, "No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." And I put in parentheses here, made known, because my translation says explained, but I don't know. I like that translation in particular where it says he has made him known. So there's this one. No one's ever seen God, but then there's also someone who is the begotten one of God, like a son, who has seen him, and he has come to make him known. He has come to explain him. And so now let's go to the first instance that glory is mentioned in John. If you will, turn over just a page to chapter 2, or maybe it's in the same opening. I don't know. My Bible has really big print, so I have to turn over for almost every reference to a different page. But in chapter 2, verse 11, we have this story right before this of Jesus turning the water into wine. So we know that Jesus is this one who's going to come and he's going to explain. He make God known. And look at what it says here. Right after this miracle happens where he turns the water into wine at a wedding feast, it says, Jesus did this in Cana of Galilee as the beginning of his signs and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, manifested is a word that's kind of been twisted today. It means a lot of different things, but don't ever let someone's misunderstanding of something define your understanding of it, because manifest is a very cool, like very biblical word. What Jesus is doing, what John is saying that Jesus did right here by turning water into wine to celebrate a feast is the beginning of his signs that revealed, that manifested his glory, Jesus' glory, which we know that Jesus is revealing God, who God is. So Jesus is revealing to us the glory of God. And so then, like, what does that look like as we read through here? As we keep reading through this gospel, it looks like a woman at a well who's been rejected multiple times by multiple husbands, being given the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. It looks like people who are sick being healed. It looks like those who are outcast having good news preached to them. It looks like the blind seeing, the lame walking. It looks like Jesus walking on the sea. Like, what is this glory that he's manifesting? It's all these different ways that Jesus showed us who God is and what God's nature is. But then if you go all the way towards the end of the book, chapter 12, turn over to chapter 12. Because as you're reading through, Jesus talks about how his hour hasn't come. His hour hasn't come. His hour hasn't come. 7 times he says that. Happened, wouldn't you know it, in the Gospel of John. He says, my hour has not come. But on the final time, he says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. In John chapter 12 and verse 23. John chapter 12 and verse 23. These Gentile Greeks, they come seeking Jesus. And then they say, Philip and Andrew come and they tell Jesus this. And then in John chapter 12 and verse 23, Jesus answered them saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And so glory, as we mentioned, is the character and who God is. And Jesus is saying, now is the time has come for me to be glorified. And so look at what he says in verse 27. He says, now my soul has become dismayed, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And then a voice came from heaven, I have both glorified it and I will glorify it again. And so what is the moment that's about to happen where God's glory is going to fully be revealed, where he's fully going to be shown who he is in his character and his nature? Is it going to be something that looks like Sinai, that looks like a really powerful cloud descending with thunder and lightning and fire? Is it going to look like the Exodus with the 10 plagues, where God comes in with a strong arm and like defeats Pharaoh and like splits the sea and then the waters destroy him? What does it look like when God is truly glorified and his nature and his character is truly revealed? We'll turn over to chapter 19. John chapter 19. You might have forgotten it, but we've been talking about how when someone is crowned, it's setting them apart for the glory of God. Now let's read John chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. Then Pilate took Jesus, and he flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. And they were coming to him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and giving him slaps in the face. And Pilate came out again, and he said to them, Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, so you know that I find no guilt in him. Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So what is the moment? Where's the moment that our Lord is crowned as the one who is going to be glorified, lifted up, like in Isaiah, the one who's going to be like a banner that everyone rallies to? What's that moment where his resting place is glorious? It's a crown of thorns. And it's a man suffering and dying on a cross in a great act of love. That's what God's glory fully revealed looks like. That's who God truly is in his heart of hearts and in the core of his character, is an act of love, of self-sacrifice. That's what glory is in the Gospel of John and in all of the Bible. God's glory is revealed through this act, through the cross and through the empty tomb. That's what God's glory is. And so then, but what we see is that the crown of thorns, it's transformed because of what Christ did. His crown of thorns is transformed into the crown of glory. Because if you remember in the very, 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 very beginning in Genesis chapter 3, the curse of man was that the ground would now produce thorns and thistles. But now Jesus takes that curse and he wears it on his head, and that curse becomes transformed into the glory. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews, if I can find it too. Okay, Hebrews chapter 2. Starting in verse 5. Says, "For he did not subject to angels the world to come, concerning which he was speaking. But once it has been testified somewhere, saying, what is man that you remember him, or the son of man that you are concerned about him? You made him a little lower than all the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have appointed him over the works of your hands, and you put all things in subjection under his feet. For in subjecting all things to him, he has not left anything that is not subjected to him. But we do not yet see all things subjected to him. But we do see him who is made a little lower than the angels, that is Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." So the cross, that moment where Jesus is crowned, his coronation as king and representative of God's glory, is the cross. Is that moment. What is the upside down, confusing nature of the cross is that our glorious God who sits on high is the one who comes down low and is the one who humbles himself to the death of a cross and then is exalted to God's right hand. And so, like, just meditating on that in itself is something so just like mind-blowing. And I this is just another lesson that I'm like giving on a Sunday night, but like this is what it all revolves around. Like this is like why we meet together every first day of the week. We remember this moment of a great act of love and a great act of sacrifice that God did for us, so that we could now participate in that glory, so that we can also receive a crown. And I kept trying to think of like a quick one-liner to kind of wrap this up. And I was thinking of something like, he wore a crown of thorns so we could wear a crown of life. Because if you turn over to Revelation chapter 2, that's what's mentioned there. He says, stay faithful to the end and you will receive a crown of life. Be faithful until death and I will give you a crown of life. But it's not just that. It's the fact that what Christ did is he transformed that curse and that crown of thorns into the crown of glory and the crown of life. Because now we participate in who he is. Like that's what it means for us to now be ones who glorify God, is that we become who he is. We're transformed by the renewing of our mind. We put on the new man, and then we're transformed into his image. And then by transforming into his image, we become also like Christ in his suffering, in the way that he went about doing good to all those in need, in the way that he submitted himself to the Father, even to the point of death. We share in that as well. But then here's the most beautiful image. Whenever I was just tracing this theme of crowns, and it was like amazing how it was the revelation of God's glory, and then now we share in also being crowned in that way. But the only thing you see crowns being used for around the throne of God is being laid down. Turn over to chapter 4, just a couple pages over. Because it's a scene around the throne room of God in heaven. And John says, I saw around the throne were 24 thrones, and upon those thrones I saw 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. And out of the throne came forth flashings and lightnings and sounds of thunder and burning fire from the throne, which are the seven spirits of God. But hop down to verse 6 there. Revelation chapter 4, verse 6. Says, before the throne was standing a sea of glass, and in the center and around the throne 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first creature was a lion, the second a calf, the third had the face of a man, the fourth was a flying eagle. And the 4 creatures, each having 6 wings full of eyes, around and within, day and night, did not cease to say, holy, holy, holy is Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And when the living creatures gave glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, then the 24 elders, they fell down before him who sits on the throne and worshiped him on the throne who lives forever and ever. And they cast their crowns down before the throne, saying, "Worthy are you, O Lord, our God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and because of you, they existed and were created." That's our destiny, and that's where we're headed. Because anything that we think is glory for us, it's in the wrong category now. Everything we do and become is for God's glory, for his goodness, for his likeness, and for his image. And so when it comes to this, to conclude here, with this idea of glory, to glorify him is to become like him in every way. And so if you will, we'll close with this passage in Ephesians chapter 3, because I think it's summed up so beautifully here. And honestly, this is a wonderful prayer that Paul gives at the end of chapter 3 that we would all do well to take upon ourselves. But here he says, "For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that he would give to you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being firmly rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly above all that we could ask or understand, according to the power that works within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen." And so, as we conclude and wrap up this evening, I hope this has encouraged you in the way that what Christ fully manifested on that cross was that God is love. And again, don't let the world's misunderstanding of what love is be what defines love in our eyes. Because this isn't a love that's just like a feeling or something that's fleeting and passing. This is a love that is self-sacrificing. This is a love that makes you do hard things. And to be God's glory, to glorify him, is to take on that love and let that be what roots us and helps us grow, and then we bear fruit for him. That's what it means to glorify God. That's what it means to be his glory, is to take on his love and his life and then go forth and bear good fruit in that way. So if there's anyone here this evening who needs to turn back and repent and to turn back to producing that good fruit and being that image of God, we'll gather around you and we'll pray for you and we'll build you up in love. And if there's anyone who hasn't taken on the image of Christ yet, you need his help and you need to commit yourself to him to begin that transformation process, to be made into his image.